Now that we have an account set up and our software installed, it's time to get started using it. GitHub uses the term repository. In fact, this is quite common across the Git vocabulary. A repository is basically an area for our code. So for example, it's common to separate your different projects into a repository each. Now this isn't a hard and fast rule. You may have many projects in a solution and it might make more sense to store the entire solution in a repository. The point is, it is entirely up to you. A repository is just a way of grouping your code, projects or solutions. When we create a repository, we'll have a copy of it at the server and at your machine or the client. Because of this, we have two options. We can create the repository at the server and clone it down to our client, or we can create it at the client and publish it up to the server. In this lecture, we'll have a look at doing both. First, we'll add a repository or repo. Developers are fairly lazy after all. At the server, and then we'll clone it down. So while you're logged into GitHub from the main page, we can simply go to this little window here and say new repository. We need to send some basic information. So for example, we need to give it a name. So I'm going to just call this server side repo, just because we're creating it at the server. We can give it a description. This is entirely optional, and we can mark it public or private. Now because we're currently using the free account, we can only create public repositories. This means anybody can see it. If we want to use a private, we would have to upgrade to a paid account. We also have these options down here: add gitignore files or add licenses. The gitignore file is a special file that tells GitHub to ignore certain files when we're syncing them between client and server. Now the reason why we might want to do this is because some programming languages, Microsoft C# for example, stores certain files or links to certain files such as other repositories or NuGet packages, and we don't necessarily want to save all these or any compiled binaries. So if we look at this, for example, we could go to Visual Studio, and this would add a special file that tells us when we're syncing to ignore these special kind of files. For now, however, we're just going to say none. And finally, if we want, we can add various licenses. Again, for the time being, I wouldn't worry too much about this. When we're ready to go, quite simply hit the Create Repository button. So once that's created, it'll take you to the main page for our repository. So let's take a look at a few things. First of all, notice our actual name up here. So we have our account name /server-side repo. Also, let's note the URL. This is basically the same. So we have github.com/your account name and then /server-side repo. This is handy to know when you want to share this with other people. Now by default we're looking at the code tab, but we have a number of other tabs as well. So for example, we have an issues tab, pull requests, wikis and so on. And these are just all places where you can enter extra information about your repository you're creating. We also have this settings tab here where we can set things like who can collaborate, deployment keys, and also where you can actually delete the repository if you decide you no longer want it. But we're going to concentrate on the code tab. So we've got some basic information here. It's saying we've got 1 commit, 1 branch, 0 releases and 1 contributor. Now 1 commit means I've added one lot of information to this. So every time you do some updates and you want to apply any new work or change you've made, you commit them to your repository, and this shows you how many commits there has been. We spoke earlier about the ability to branch, and we'll go into that in more detail in the next lecture, but up here is where it shows you how many branches you have. And finally, we can see there is one contributor, which is of course myself, because I created it. We can also, within the website itself, create new files, upload files, or clone or download. Now, clone or download is how we actually get, one of the ways we can get it from the server to our client, and we will come back to that. But finally, what we will see in here is this file. So this is going to list all our files in this bit of the window here, and we can see at the moment we just have one file, which is the readme.md, and this was the file that was created because we clicked that initialize tab. If we click on there, it actually opens the file up, and we can see that this is just a file with one line that's 16 bytes in size, and here is the text. If we click back on our code tab at the top, it takes back to the main window. And if we click in the clone or drop down box, we can say here we can either open this in the desktop, we can download the entire repository as a zip file, that's more of a manual thing, or we can actually copy this path to the clipboard, and this path here is basically what we have up at the top here, and this is handy if we want to use the command line tools. We can say copy to clipboard and then paste that into a command window to do it that way. But the first way we're going to get the software down is, instead of using either of these, we're actually going to go into our client and pull the repository down to our local machine. So we'll just minimize that, and so now we're going to run the GitHub client. For the first time you open it, you may receive a security warning. Just go ahead and click run. So here we go, this is our client window, and just like the server was, we currently have no repositories. So this is saying on our client machine we don't have anything set up. So the first thing we want to do is add the repository we've just created at the server. So we go to this button up here, create, and we're going to say clone, because what we want to do is clone it from the server. Because our client is already set up with our GitHub account, it can see here our repository that we've just set up, and down here clone server-side repo, and hit the tick button. It now asks us where we want to put it. Now what I generally tend to do is put all my repositories within a GitHub folder within my documents folder. So simply click OK, and what that is going to do now, it's taking all the files and copying them down. So in this window we can see at the moment we're looking at what's called the change tab, and there are no changes. We've also this history tab, so if we click that, and we can see here a history of all the changes that have happened in our software. And of course at the moment we only really have one change, which is this initial commit. But if we highlight it, which it was by default, we can see what files are in here and what files were actually committed as part of it. So we can see it added a file called readme, and it added a line with just this server-side repo text. All this will make will become a bit more obvious as we start to add code of our own. The next thing I'd like to see is if we go to the server-side repo and right click, we can say open in Explorer. So if we do that, it then takes us to the file location where we've actually told it to store the code. So next let's do it the other way around. Let's create a client-side repository and push it up to the server. Once again we're going to go up to this plus button up here, and this time we're going to click the create button. So what we can do is we can give it a name, so we will call this client side repo, and you can see by default it's going to store it to this local path with the name that we've just given it. Again, we've got the option to add a gitignore file if we want, but again we will just leave that at none for now. So when we're ready, we click create repository. Now you'll notice it's gone under here, other, rather than under the GitHub, and that's because at the moment this repository is only client side. So if we go and open Explorer, we can see it's in our GitHub folder in a client side repo. So the first thing we want to do is get this up to the server. So now if we go over to this button here, which is publish, and just click it, at this point we can now we can keep the name and again put a description. Once again, if we actually had a paid account, we could turn it into a private repository, but we're going to leave all that as it is and just click publish client-side repo. That's now pushed up to the server. We can see here now it's gone back up there. And if we go to our server, we go to our root that shows the list of all our repos, we can now see that we've got two repositories, our server-side repo that we created server-side and the new client-side repo that we've just created client-side. In the next lecture, we're going to look at how we actually add and edit files and keep them in sync between the servers.